The wind howled across the flat coastal plain of Bawdsey Manor, a lonely estate on England's eastern edge, where the grey waters of the North Sea stretched toward an invisible enemy. It was 1936, and Europe was restless again. In the high, drafty rooms of the manor, a handful of men worked under secrecy so tight that most of them didn't even know what the others were doing. The walls smelled of old salt and dust, and the place was alive with the faint hum of strange machines. At night, the estate glowed faintly with green light as cathode ray screens flickered and wires hissed in the dark. Robert Watson Watt leaned over a rough workbench, sleeves rolled to the elbow, eyes hollowed from nights without sleep. Around him were tangled coils of copper wire, valves that glowed like embers, and a thin ribbon of radio static whispering through the air. He was not a soldier, not even a fighter by nature. He was a man of equations, of invisible waves and precise timing. Yet, he knew what he was building might one day save his island. Across the channel, the world was changing faster than he could calculate. Hitler had reoccupied the Rhineland. The Luftwaffe was growing stronger each month, and rumors of new German aircraft filled the British newspapers. Somewhere in Berlin, their scientists were working too, perhaps on something just as invisible. Every test, every spark that jumped across a circuit here at Bawdsey was part of a race that no one had officially declared, but everyone felt. The first time the signal came back, it was by accident. They had set up a crude transmitter on the coast and aimed it out to sea, hoping to catch the echo of a passing aircraft. The receivers crackled uselessly for hours. The sky was clear, the equipment uncooperative. Then, late in the afternoon, a faint pulse appeared. Just a blip on a green screen. The men crowded around. "Could be a bird," muttered one of the engineers. "Or a storm front." Watson Watt shook his head slowly. "No," he said, almost whispering. "That's an aircraft." For a moment, the room was silent. The echo had come from miles away, from something they could not see, but now knew was there. It was as if they had opened a new sense for mankind, one that could feel through fog and night. By 1939, as Europe slid into war, the system had grown into a network of tall metal towers along the British coast. Chain home, they called it. They looked awkward and fragile, like scaffolds for some unfinished monument, but they reached out hundreds of miles, scanning the empty air for intruders. Few people knew what they were. Even fewer understood that these strange steel forests were England's first shield. When the war began, and the Luftwaffe's bombers began to gather in France, the British pilots, who would later be called the Few, were still training in outdated Hurricanes and Spitfires barely out of prototype. They were brave, but bravery alone could not defend a nation. The enemy had more planes, more pilots, more fuel. But Britain had something invisible, a web of energy that could see across the sea before the enemy was near enough to strike. In a control room near Dover, a young woman named Alice Ferris sat before a glowing radar display. She was part of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, one of the dozens trained to interpret the ghostly dots that shimmered on the screens. It was tedious work, demanding unbroken concentration, but Alice had learned to read the difference between noise and danger. A slow sweep of the line, a heartbeat later, another. And then, faintly, a cluster of echoes appeared at the edge of the scope. Her pulse quickened. She called it in to the filter room. Within minutes, a telephone line to Fighter Command Headquarters was buzzing, and sirens were wailing across the south coast. Up in the air, Flight Lieutenant Peter Garland of No. 74 Squadron throttled his Spitfire into a climbing turn. His radio crackled with calm, clipped voices from the ground controllers. Angels 15, Vector 085. Multiple bandits approaching Dover. Estimated 40+. Garland didn't know who was guiding him or how they knew, but he trusted the voice. Beneath him, the channel glittered like glass. Ahead, the horizon darkened with moving shapes, hundreds of them. The first major radar-assisted intercept took place that summer, when the Luftwaffe's bombers crossed at dawn. Without radar, they would have struck unopposed, catching the RAF on the ground. But the radar stations had seen them form over Calais more than 20 minutes before they reached the coast. Fighters scrambled from Biggin Hill, Tangmere, and Manston, climbing to meet the invaders at precisely the right moment. Garland saw them first, long black silhouettes of Heinkels and Dorniers flanked by Messerschmitts. He pushed the throttle forward, felt the engine scream, and dived into the formation. Tracer fire streaked past his cockpit. "Tally-ho!" he shouted into the radio, though his voice shook. The battle unfolded like a furious dance of smoke and sunlight. But somewhere far below, the calm voice of the controller kept directing reinforcements, adjusting altitude, calling out bearings, watching the radar returns shift as aircraft fought and fell. By evening, more than half the German bombers had turned back, many streaming smoke. The ones that reached their targets dropped hurriedly and fled. The next morning, the newspapers spoke of heroism in the air, of Spitfires and courage. No one mentioned the strange green eyes watching from the coast. The radar operators were not named. Their buildings had no signs. Their victory was silent. Watson Watt watched the reports from a small office in London, his name still buried under secrecy. He knew the system worked, but he also knew how fragile it was. The enemy might soon discover it. At night, he walked home through streets already darkened by blackout curtains, thinking of the young men and women whose lives now depended on his invention. He often thought of the irony that the power to see the unseen had come not from military genius, but from a scientist's curiosity about radio waves bouncing off clouds. As the Battle of Britain raged through August and September of 1940, the system was stretched to its limits. German intelligence never fully grasped how Britain always seemed ready, how the RAF always rose to meet them. They suspected spies, broken codes, or extraordinary luck. They never realized that invisible towers along the coast were painting the sky with radio waves, revealing every formation long before it crossed the sea. One night, during a raid on London, the radar stations themselves became targets. Bawdsey, the birthplace of it all, was bombed. The operators hid beneath concrete bunkers as explosions rattled the earth. When the power lines were severed, they crawled through debris to reconnect them by hand. The next morning, when the enemy returned, the radar was already back on air. For Alice Ferris, the endless cycle of alarms and echoes became her whole world. She slept in her uniform, ate between shifts, and sometimes dreamed in the rhythm of the radar sweep, a ghostly pulse that never stopped. She never saw the pilots she guided, never knew their faces. But once, after a heavy raid, a young airman came to the operations hut, still in his flight suit. He asked for the woman who had called out Vector 170 at 10:45 that morning. Alice raised her hand uncertainly. The pilot smiled, eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You saved us," he said simply. Then he turned and walked away. By 1941, radar had spread far beyond Britain. In the Pacific, in the deserts of North Africa, even aboard ships, it became the unseen guardian. It watched through fog, through darkness, through storm. It changed the nature of warfare. No longer did surprise rule the sky. The Americans would later refine it, miniaturize it, mount it on planes and submarines, turning the invisible into an advantage. But in those first desperate years, on that narrow island standing alone, it was the difference between survival and annihilation. The radar towers, silhouetted against the dawn, looked like skeletons of a new age, fragile, humming, alive. When the war finally turned, when bombers began flying east instead of west, when convoys crossed the Atlantic under radar watch and D-Day was planned under its protection, few remembered the sleepless men of Bawdsey or the women like Alice staring at ghostly screens in the dark. Yet every victory carried their fingerprints, a reflection of signals sent long ago into empty air, waiting to come back. Watson. Watt lived long enough to see radar shrink from rooms of humming valves to small metal boxes that could fit on a plane. But he rarely spoke of glory. When once asked if he considered himself a hero, he smiled faintly and said, "Heroes fight. I only helped them see." Outside his window, aircraft flew freely through peaceful skies. No enemy shadows crossed the channel anymore. But sometimes, when the sun set over the North Sea, he thought he could still hear the faint hum of the transmitters, still see the flicker of a green pulse in the dark, the heartbeat of a nation that had once seen its salvation in the invisible. The winter of 1941 came hard to Britain. The nights were longer, colder, and more dangerous. German bombers crossed the channel under cover of darkness, guided by their own primitive radio beams. The Blitz turned the cities into fields of fire. In London, the docks burned, and the river reflected the glow like molten glass. Yet, even in the darkness, the pulse of radar beat steadily. Alice Ferris, promoted now to senior operator, worked in a new underground bunker near Ventnor. Above her, the radar masts towered over the Isle of Wight cliffs, battered by wind and salt. Below, the room hummed with machines. The rhythmic sweep of the cathode ray, the soft whir of paper recorders, the clipped voices of young women passing information to fighter command. Sleep was a luxury none could afford. When the alarms came, they came in clusters. Raid approaching Portsmouth, Angels 18. And then, silence. While the aircraft climbed to intercept, she'd listen to the hum of the radar and imagine the pilots above. Tiny shapes among the stars, guided by echoes she had seen first. One night, the signals grew strange. The echoes came in double, then triple lines. It took them hours to realize the Germans were using new tactics: decoy bombers, jammers, and radio confusion. The air war was no longer just one of speed and guns, but of invisible duels between scientists. The enemy was learning. In London, Robert Watson Watt sat in yet another meeting deep inside the Air Ministry. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wool. Around the table sat men in uniforms, air marshals, admirals, and ministers, none of whom fully understood how radar worked, only that it must. He was tired, older now, his once dark hair turning gray at the temples. He had argued for months for better funding, better secrecy, and now for countermeasures. The Germans had discovered Nickebein, a system of guiding beams. If they could do that, they could one day jam Britain's own. "Then jam them back," said one of the officers. Watson Watt gave a tired smile. "We already have." The countermeasure came in the form of window. Thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft, creating false radar echoes and blinding the enemy's screens. The first tests were clumsy, the sky filled with drifting silver snow, but the results were staggering. When the technique was used during the Hamburg raid of 1943, German radar operators saw 1,000 ghosts on their scopes, unable to tell illusion from reality. Their night fighters circled helplessly while the bombers flew through untouched. But before that triumph came the struggle. The war stretched on, and with it, radar's reach extended beyond the coasts. In the shipyards of Liverpool and Glasgow, welders worked through blackout nights fitting small radar sets into the bows of escort ships. The Atlantic had become a graveyard for Allied convoys. U-boats prowled unseen beneath the waves, picking off ships one by one. Sailors whispered of wolves that struck in silence and vanished before a shot could be fired. Commander James Huxley of the Royal Navy had seen too many men die. His destroyer, HMS Vigilant, was part of the Atlantic escort fleet, tasked with shepherding convoys through storms and submarines. The sea in winter was cruel. Waves high as houses, the decks coated with ice, and the constant fear that beneath the surface something listened. Then, one bleak morning in 1942, his ship received one of the first operational shipborne radars, a bulky contraption with a spinning antenna that looked more like a clothesline than a weapon. The technician who installed it, a boy barely 20, assured him it could detect periscopes or surfaced submarines miles away. Huxley had nodded politely. He'd believe it when he saw it. 2 weeks later, on a fog-bound night, he did. The convoy was crawling through the mist, visibility near zero. The sea was calm, unnaturally so. Men spoke in whispers, afraid of sound. Then, deep in the control room, a faint pulse appeared on the new radar screen. A flicker at 5 miles, then 4. The young operator called it out, voice shaking. Huxley ordered the engines to full and turned hard toward the contact. The crew peered into the fog and saw nothing. But when they dropped depth charges, the sea erupted, and moments later oil and debris surfaced. Cheers echoed through the ship. The boy at the radar console wept quietly, wiping his face with his sleeve. The invisible enemy had finally been seen. From that day forward, radar became as vital to the sea war as the compass. Convoys began to arrive in greater numbers. Submarines that once hunted in darkness now found themselves hunted. The tide of the Atlantic was turning, not with brute force, but with science. Meanwhile, across the world, another war was brewing in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans poured their vast resources into radar technology. Theirs was smaller, more portable, refined by the lessons the British had learned. In the jungles of Guadalcanal and the islands of the Solomons, radar sets watched the skies for Japanese bombers approaching by night. The U.S. Navy installed it on every ship, and suddenly, surprise attacks became rarer. Battles that once depended on sunlight could now be fought in the dark. In 1943, British and American scientists began working side by side, sharing what had once been state secrets. Watson Watt visited the United States, walking through laboratories filled with equipment far beyond what his team had once built by hand. He felt both pride and melancholy. Pride that his crude towers had birthed this revolution, and melancholy that war had demanded it. Everywhere he went, he saw radar dishes turning like silent sentinels, their invisible beams sweeping the horizon. Alice Ferris, still stationed in southern England, watched a different kind of war now. The raids were fewer but deadlier. The Germans sent V-1 flying bombs, pilotless engines of destruction. They came low and fast, often at night. Radar saw them before anyone else could, giving just enough time to scramble fighters or aim anti-aircraft guns. The pulse returns came as sharp, fast blips, a heartbeat of death racing toward London. Each detection meant lives saved, but also reminded Alice how relentless the war had become. On one such night, the signal came suddenly. Dozens of fast-moving contacts inbound. She called them out, voice steady but heart pounding. The guns opened fire over the coast. Minutes later, the sound of distant explosions rolled through the ground. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering to herself, "We saw them first." Months turned into years. By 1944, radar had become everywhere and nowhere. An invisible web covering the Earth. From Normandy's beaches to the skies over Berlin, it guided bombers, directed ships, and even helped medics locate lost paratroopers. On D-Day, the Allied fleet's radar screens lit up with hundreds of contacts, not enemies, but friends, the largest armada in history, moving under the cover of fog and secrecy. Each vessel knew its position, each aircraft knew when to strike. The Germans were blind. Their coastal radars, confused by window and jamming signals, saw only phantoms. Watson Watt listened to the BBC broadcast that morning, tears stinging his eyes. He knew that radar, the child of an idea born in the cold halls of Baudsy, was now guiding the liberation of Europe. He remembered the first faint echo of an aircraft years ago, and now there were thousands sweeping across the channel not as invaders, but as saviors. On the beaches, chaos reigned. Smoke, gunfire, courage, and fear. Amid that chaos, radar on Allied ships kept order, tracking aircraft, warning of incoming shells, guiding landing craft through fog and confusion. It was as if an unseen intelligence hovered over the fleet, seeing all, directing all. The invasion succeeded not just through valor, but through vision. Vision made possible by waves of energy dancing invisibly through the air. When the war neared its end, the scientists who had lived in secrecy were finally allowed to breathe. The towers of Chain Home still stood along the cliffs, rusting but proud. The world had changed. In the spring of 1945, Alice Ferris received a letter. Not an order this time, but an invitation. She was to attend a small ceremony at Bawdsey Manor. Curious and nervous, she traveled by train through a countryside blooming with peace for the first time in years. At the manor, she found Watson Watt standing by the shore, staring at the old transmitters now silent and still. He was older, thinner, his eyes reflective. "You must be Miss Ferris," he said, smiling faintly. "I've heard your name before. You watched over our pilots when the world was burning." She shook her head. "We just read the screens, sir." He looked out toward the sea. "And in reading them, you gave sight to a nation." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the waves crash against the stones. The air was clear, the sky empty. For the first time in years, no one was coming to kill them. In the years that followed, radar left the war behind, but not its importance. It became the heartbeat of peace, guiding planes safely through storms, tracking weather, exploring the stars. What began as a desperate experiment had changed the course of history. Watson Watt retired quietly, refusing honors and titles. When asked once what radar truly meant to him, he said, "It was not about seeing the enemy. It was about never being blind again." And for Alice, long after she left the service, she sometimes dreamed of the green glow of the radar screen, the slow, sweeping line, the tiny flickers of light that once foretold life or death. In those dreams, she was back in the bunker, the hum of the machine around her, the pulse steady and sure, whispering through the dark that help was coming, that someone was watching, that nothing would be unseen again. The war's final months were a strange mix of exhaustion and revelation. Germany was collapsing, yet the violence was at its most desperate. The Luftwaffe, once a terror of Europe, was reduced to fragments, flying by night, striking where it could. But even those last attacks could no longer hide. Radar saw them before they rose from the runways. In February 1945, deep inside a damp underground bunker near Dover, the operators no longer flinched when the alarms went off. For years, the green sweep of the cathode ray tube had been their companion, their enemy, their window to the world. The hum of the machine was almost comforting now. Alice Ferris, still at her post after 5 relentless years, watched one of those final raids unfold. A small cluster of echoes moving slowly toward London. She called out bearings, relayed coordinates, and then listened as the ground-controlled interceptors took flight. Within minutes, the blips scattered. Some vanished entirely. One faded into nothing, swallowed by the channel of interference that meant destruction. She marked it, quietly, and exhaled. When the all-clear came, no one cheered anymore. The war was ending not with celebration, but with fatigue. The operators removed their headsets, rubbed their eyes, and stepped out into the dawn. Outside, the cliffs were pink with sunrise, and the air smelled of salt. Alice stood for a moment, watching the sky she had guarded for so long. Somewhere out there, perhaps miles away, smoke curled up from the wreckage of another enemy bomber. The victory felt hollow, necessary, inevitable. In London, Robert Watson Watt was summoned once more to the War Office. He arrived wearing the same threadbare coat he'd worn through half the war, refusing to trade it for anything new. The corridors were still darkened by blackout curtains, but the sense of dread had lifted. Officers smiled again. They spoke of peace, of reconstruction, of a new world that would soon rise from the ruins. On a long oak table before him lay a pile of reports, the history of radar's role in the war. Diagrams, statistics, intercepted transmissions, success rates. Watson Watt leafed through them absently, his mind wandering to the early days at Bawdsey, when none of this had seemed possible. One of the generals, a heavy-set man with a booming voice, clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, Doctor, your contraptions won us the war." Watson Watt smiled thinly. "Machines don't win wars, General. People do. Machines only let them survive long enough to matter." The general laughed, but the scientist's words hung in the air like static. That spring, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and the last German resistance collapsed, radar had one final task to perform. Along the coasts of France and the Netherlands, radar stations tracked the retreating U-boats trying to escape into the Atlantic. British and American aircraft, guided by the flicker of their screens, hunted them down with deadly precision. What had begun as an early warning device had become an instrument of pursuit. The hunter's eye in the dark. Commander James Huxley, aboard HMS Vigilant, was still at sea when word of Germany's surrender reached them. The crew gathered on deck as the sun set over a calm sea. Some wept, others sang, some simply stood in silence. Huxley looked toward the radar mast, still rotating steadily, sweeping a horizon that no longer held enemies. He thought of all the nights it had guided them, all the times that strange green pulse had meant life instead of death. He reached up and touched the metal railing, whispering, "Stand down, old friend." In May, Europe was finally free. But even as crowds filled the streets, even as Churchill's voice echoed through the radio, "This is your victory," many of those who had made that victory possible stayed silent, their work still secret. The radar operators, the scientists, the engineers. They slipped quietly back into civilian life, their achievements classified, their names unspoken. Alice Ferris was demobilized in June 1945. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase and left the bunker for the last time. The world outside was unrecognizable. Cities scarred, fields cratered, families broken and reformed. She took a train to London, then another north to her hometown near Manchester. No one there truly understood what she had done. Her mother asked if she'd been a secretary. Alice smiled and said yes. How could she explain the language of echoes, the nights spent reading ghosts on a screen? For a while she tried to forget. She found work in a post office, lived quietly, and tried to adjust to a world without alarms. But sometimes, when thunderstorms rolled across the sky, she felt an odd comfort in the rumble, a reminder of the machines that had hummed through her youth. Meanwhile, radar itself refused to fade into silence. In laboratories across Britain, America, and Canada, scientists who had worked on wartime radar began adapting it for peace. One team turned it toward the weather, discovering they could track storms as easily as aircraft. Another turned it toward the stars, bouncing signals off the moon for the first time. The invisible had become familiar. Humanity had learned to see the unseen. Watson Watt watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He rarely gave interviews, though journalists tried. When he finally agreed to speak to one in 1946, the young reporter asked if he felt radar was the greatest invention of the war. He thought for a long moment before replying. "No," he said softly. "It was the greatest necessity of the war. Invention is born from peace. Radar was born from fear." He lived modestly, giving lectures to universities, always ending with the same line: "Give thanks to those who listened in the dark." But not all the heroes were remembered. In the archives of the Air Ministry, the names of hundreds of radar operators remained hidden under classified markings for decades. Many died, never knowing the full impact of what they had done. The towers of Chainholme were dismantled, their steel sold for scrap. Only a few masts remained, rusting against the sea wind, witnesses to a war that radar had seen unfold before anyone else could. Years passed. The world changed again. Jet engines replaced propellers. Rockets reached the edge of space. Radar became a word everyone knew, but few understood. Airliners crossed continents guided by its invisible hands. Ships navigated safely through fog that once spelled disaster. And in distant laboratories, new generations built upon the same principles. Microwaves, radio astronomy, satellite communication, all descendants of those early echoes that had saved a nation. In 1952, Alice Ferris, now Mrs. Alice Morgan, visited London for the first time in years. Her husband was a teacher, her children still young. One afternoon, she wandered through a museum newly opened to the public, the Science Museum's War in the Air exhibit. Among the displays of aircraft engines and uniforms, she found a small section behind glass, the radar room. Inside was a cathode ray tube, dull and green with age. A sign read, "Replica of a Chainholme radar receiver, circa 1940. She stood there for a long time. Her reflection ghosted on the glass like the echoes she used to read. Visitors passed behind her, children pointing, old men murmuring. But for Alice, the room faded away. She could hear the hum again, smell the faint ozone, feel the vibration under her fingertips as the sweep crossed the screen. A curator noticed her lingering and approached. "Fascinating bit of kit, isn't it?" he said cheerfully. She smiled faintly. "Yes, I used to operate one of these." He blinked in surprise. "Did you? During the war?" "Yes." For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "Then I suppose I should thank you." Alice shook her head. "Don't thank me. Thank the people who built it. I just watched." But as she turned to go, the curator called after her. "Still, you saw what others couldn't." She paused at the door, that single sentence warming something deep inside her. That night, she walked along the Thames. The city was whole again, bridges rebuilt, lights glowing along the riverbanks. Aircraft droned overhead, peaceful now, their paths traced by radar invisible to all. She looked up and thought of those who had never come home, of the pilots who had fought guided by unseen eyes, of the scientists who had risked ridicule and failure. She whispered a silent goodbye to them all. Watson Watt, in his later years, would sometimes visit Bawdsey. The manor still stood, half ruined by time and weather, but the view of the sea was the same. Standing on the cliff, he would imagine the early experiments, the clumsy transmitters, the excitement of that first echo. He often said he could still hear it, faintly, in the wind. The world's first whisper of radar returning home. He died quietly in 1973, long after radar had become a part of everyday life. His name appeared in obituaries, but even then, few grasped the depth of his legacy. One article called him the man who gave Britain eyes. Another simply said, he helped win the Battle of Britain. But those who knew him, the engineers, the operators, the ones who had worked beside him in the cold halls of Bawdsey, remembered him not as a hero, but as a man who believed in the power of listening. By the end of the century, radar had evolved beyond imagination. Satellites mapped entire continents. Aircraft flew through storms guided by precision radar altimeters. The same principles that once saved Britain now helped explore other planets. Yet somewhere in that technological lineage, a trace of 1936 remained. The echo of a single aircraft crossing the North Sea, the pulse of a signal bouncing back to a group of tired men in a manor by the sea. And though the world moved on, the human part of the story never faded. In small towns across Britain, Old women and men who had once been WAF operators or radar technicians gathered for reunions. They swapped stories of night shifts, of near misses, of laughter in the face of fear. They were gray-haired now, their memories blurred, but their pride intact. When asked what they had done during the war, they smiled and said, "We watched the sky." One of them, an old woman with bright eyes and a faint northern accent, was Alice Morgan. She was nearly 80 by then, walking with a cane, her hearing fading but her voice steady. During one reunion, a young reporter asked her if she still dreamed of the radar screen. "Sometimes," she said softly, "but it's not the dots I remember. It's the silence before they appeared. That moment when the world held its breath, waiting for us to see." The reporter asked what it felt like, knowing she'd helped change the course of history. Alice looked out the window toward the sea. "It didn't feel like history," she said. "It felt like duty. We didn't think we were changing the world. We just wanted to keep it alive." The sun set over the horizon, turning the sky gold and crimson. Somewhere far out at sea, a ship's radar beam swept in slow circles, invisible, unending. The quiet heartbeat of a world once blind, now forever watching. The world that emerged from the ashes of war was brighter, faster, noisier. But beneath all the change, radar still pulsed quietly. Invisible, indispensable, unchanged in essence. Its waves crossed oceans and mountains, watching everything that moved, a silent guardian of a fragile peace. In the summer of 1957, a British Airways flight crossed the Atlantic on a course plotted entirely by radar and radio navigation. On board, passengers sipped coffee and looked out over endless cloud. None of them realized that the calm voice of the pilot, the smoothness of their journey, depended on the same principles that had once guided Spitfires through smoke and gunfire. The same kind of signal that once spotted enemy bombers now watched for turbulence and storms. The war-born invention had grown into the quiet technology of trust. Far below that flight path, in a small cottage near Suffolk, an old radar dish rusted in a field. The farm workers ignored it, thinking it a relic of some forgotten experiment. But to those who had once lived under its hum, it was something else entirely. A monument to a time when invisible waves decided the fate of nations. Alice Morgan lived not far from there. Her hair was white now, her hands delicate but still steady. Her children had grown, her husband had passed away, and her house was filled with the ticking of clocks, perhaps because she had always found comfort in rhythm. The sweep of the radar had been a kind of heartbeat once, and she liked the sound of things that moved in time. She rarely spoke of the war unless asked, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, her granddaughter would sit with her and ask about the screen that could see. Alice would smile and tell her about the faint green light, the circular sweep, the ghostly echoes that appeared and vanished. She would describe how, on nights when the world seemed about to end, that screen had been their only hope. "But weren't you afraid?" the girl once asked. "Always," Alice replied. "But we learned to live with fear. It became part of the air we breathed. What mattered was that we kept watching." Outside, wind rustled the hedges, and the old woman's gaze drifted toward the east, toward the sea where she had spent her youth listening for death and salvation. Miles away, in a museum in London, a curator was preparing a new exhibit on technological breakthroughs of the 20th century. Among the displays, jet engines, early computers, atomic models, stood a restored chain home console. Its knobs were polished, its cathode ray tube glowing faintly under soft light. Visitors stopped and stared, reading the small plaque beneath. Radar, the invention that saved Britain. Developed 1935–1939 by Robert Watson Watt and the Radar Research Establishment. Operated by the Royal Air Force and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force during the Battle of Britain. Few lingered long. It was a humble-looking machine, unremarkable next to the sleek jets and rockets around it. But every so often, a veteran would pause there. Someone who had heard that hum, seen those dots, and stand in silence, remembering. Robert Watson Watt was long gone, but his legacy had outlived him in ways even he could never have imagined. The principles of radar now reached into space, mapping the surfaces of planets, measuring the distances to asteroids, guiding spacecraft through the void. In 1969, when the Apollo astronauts landed on the Moon, they used radar altimeters to guide their descent. Each pulse sent from that small instrument was a descendant of the signal first bounced off a distant aircraft over the North Sea 3 decades earlier. On the night of the Moon landing, Alice stayed up late to watch the broadcast. She sat in her armchair, wrapped in a blanket, as the black and white images flickered on the television. The astronauts' voices crackled through static, so different from the calm, clipped tones she remembered from the war, and yet, somehow, the same. When she heard the phrase, "radar contact confirmed, altitude steady," she smiled. Her heart lifted. Even here, on another world, radar was still keeping watch. Her granddaughter, sitting cross-legged on the floor, didn't understand the tears in her eyes. "Grandma, are you sad?" "No," Alice said softly. "Just proud. They're not flying blind." Years passed. The green screens became digital, the towers taller, the signals sharper. Radar grew invisible not just in its operation, but in memory. For a generation raised in peace, it was simply part of the background. Like air, like light. But the few who had been there at the beginning never forgot. In 1980, on the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, a memorial service was held at Westminster Abbey. Pilots in their 80s, scientists, engineers, and former radar operators gathered together under the great stone arches. Alice was among them. She walked slowly down the aisle, her cane tapping against the marble floor, her medals glinting softly. The service was brief but moving. Names were read aloud, some famous, most forgotten. Afterward, she stood outside among the crowd, breathing in the autumn air. A young RAF officer approached her, recognizing the small pin on her lapel that marked her as one of the early radar operators. "Ma'am," he said, standing straight, "we still use radar every day. Aircraft, ships, satellites. It's everywhere now. It's our eyes and ears," she smiled faintly. "Take care of it, then. It once took care of us." He saluted her, a gesture so sharp it made her blink back sudden tears. For a moment, she saw not him, but all the young men she'd once guided into battle. Faces she had never known, voices she had only heard through static. That evening, she wrote a letter, one of her last, addressed simply to the Air Ministry Historical Archives. It read, "To whoever keeps the records, we watched the sky. That was our duty. I hope someone remembers the sound of the machines, the hum of the transmitters, the way the green light moved like a heartbeat. It was more than just a screen. It was the light that showed us we were still alive." Alice Morgan, née Ferris, Turritor in Tonstuaren Amateurs, former WWII radar operator, Chain Home Station Ventnor, 1939–1945, the letter was filed quietly, but not forgotten. Alice passed away the following spring, in her sleep. Her family buried her on a hill overlooking the sea. On her headstone were just a few words chosen by her granddaughter. She watched the sky so others could live. And there, overlooking the same coast where the radar towers had once stood, her story ended. But the waves that rolled against the shore carried echoes still, faint, invisible, endless. Decades later, a group of engineers restoring an old chain home site found her name in an archive box, along with a faded photograph of young operators standing beside a console. One of them was Alice, smiling shyly at the camera. Her hair was pinned neatly under her cap, her eyes bright with purpose. The engineers decided to dedicate the restored station to her memory. They mounted a small bronze plaque on the wall. It read simply, "For those who watched in silence." Today, radar is everywhere. In airports, guiding planes through storms, in ships avoiding collisions in fog, in hospitals mapping hearts and lungs, in cars that brake when drivers do not. The pulse that once guarded Britain has become the pulse of civilization itself. The world depends on what it cannot see, just as it did then. But somewhere, in every echo, there lingers a fragment of that first experiment. The scratch of radio static, the faint blip on a green screen, the collective gasp of the scientists who realized that the invisible could be made visible. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of Watson Watt smiles quietly, knowing that his belief in the unseen changed the course of human history. On clear nights, when the moon is high and aircraft lights glide silently across the sky, the faint whisper of radar waves still crosses the heavens. They bounce, return, measure, and guide, the unseen heartbeat of a watchful world. And if one listens closely enough, as Watson Watt once did, in that lonely manor by the sea, perhaps one can still hear that first echo returning home across time. A reminder that victory is not always won by those who fight, but by those who see first. Fight, but by those who see first.